Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Sarah Thornfield sat motionless by the bay window of her modest Portland home, the evening news humming softly in the background. Her fingers traced the worn edges of a photo album as the July sunset painted the room in amber hues. Today marked 12 years. 12 long years since her husband Marcus and daughter Emma had vanished without a trace during what should have been a perfect family vacation. "It's almost time," Dorothy, Sarah's mother, announced gently as she placed a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder. At 68, Dorothy's face showed the weathered lines of someone who had carried not just her own grief but her daughter's as well. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the television. Every year on July 15th, she paid the local news station to broadcast the missing persons alert, a ritual of remembrance and desperate hope. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly toward the evening news hour. And now, the anchor's voice suddenly filled the room. "We have a special report on a local missing persons case." The screen filled with images that pierced Sarah's heart anew. Marcus, her beloved husband, with his distinctive red beard and kind eyes, smiling at the camera. He had been 35 then, an engineer with dreams of building bridges that would last centuries. Marcus and Emma Thornfield were last seen on July 15th, 2002, near Lake Clearwater Resort, the reporter continued. Then came Emma's picture. Her precocious 9-year-old with blonde hair cascading over her shoulders and that mischievous smile that could light up the darkest room. She was wearing her favorite pink unicorn t-shirt in the photo, the one she had insisted on packing for their trip. Their blue Toyota van was found abandoned in the resort parking lot with no signs of struggle or foul play. The reporter concluded, "Anyone with information is urged to contact the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department." Dorothy squeezed Sarah's shoulder as silent tears tracked down her daughter's cheeks. "You never know, Sarah. Someone might remember something." Sarah wiped her tears away with the back of her hand. "It's been 12 years, Mom. 12 years of these broadcasts. 12 years of dead ends and false hopes." The shrill ring of the telephone cut through the room like a knife. Sarah froze, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. Late evening calls rarely brought good news. Dorothy moved to answer it, her arthritic fingers fumbling with the receiver. "Thornfield residence," she answered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Sarah watched as her mother's expression shifted from polite inquiry to stunned disbelief. "Yes, she's right here," Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "May I ask what this is regarding?" The seconds stretched like hours as Sarah rose from her chair, the photo album sliding forgotten to the floor. The scattered pictures of happier times, family picnics, Christmas mornings, Emma's birthday parties, lay strewn across the hardwood like fragments of a shattered life. "It's Sheriff Collins from Jefferson County," Dorothy said, extending the phone with a shaking hand. He says they've found something in the lake." Sarah's world narrowed to the black plastic receiver in her mother's outstretched hand. After 12 years of nothing, could there finally be answers? With trembling fingers, she took the phone, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is Sarah Thornfield." "Mrs. Thornfield." The gruff voice of Sheriff Collins came through clearly. "I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour, but there's been a discovery at Lake Clearwater that you need to know about immediately. A fisherman found some clothing floating near the northern shore of Lake Clearwater this morning," Sheriff Collins explained, his voice grave. "A pink children's t-shirt with a unicorn design and a green wool men's jacket, both remarkably preserved by the cold lake water." Sarah's knees buckled as she sank back into her chair. "I'm coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Within 30 minutes, Sarah and Dorothy were in a police cruiser, racing through the darkness toward the Cascade Mountains. The 2-hour journey passed in a blur of twisted roads and fragmented memories. The water temperature in parts of Clearwater can drop to near freezing, the deputy driving explained. Items can be preserved for years in those conditions. When they finally arrived at the lakeside, the area was illuminated by portable floodlights. Sheriff Collins, a weathered man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, stood waiting. Beside him was a table with 2 evidence bags. "Mrs. Thornfield," "I'm sorry we're meeting again under these circumstances," he said, guiding her toward the table. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined the first bag containing the small pink t-shirt. The unicorn design was faded but unmistakable. When she turned it over, her breath caught. There was the stubborn ice cream stain from Emma's last birthday party, the one that never quite washed out. "It's hers," Sarah whispered, tears flowing freely now. "It's Emma's shirt." The second bag contained Marcus's green wool jacket, the one Sarah had given him for their 10th anniversary. She immediately recognized the small tear on the left sleeve from when he'd caught it on their garden fence. "That's Marcus's jacket," she confirmed, her voice breaking. Where were they found exactly?" "I can show you," said a deep voice from behind them. Sarah turned to see a young man, perhaps 28, with chestnut hair and intense eyes. He wore a forest ranger's uniform. "This is Jake Morrison," Sheriff Collins introduced. He guided the fisherman who found the items. "I've worked these woods for years," Jake said, his demeanor professional yet oddly familiar, as if he'd been expecting them. "The fisherman contacted me first, and I advised him to call the authorities immediately." As Jake led them to the shoreline, pointing out where the clothing had been discovered, Sarah noticed how detailed his knowledge was, not just of the area, but of the case itself. "The current in this part of the lake forms a kind of eddy," Jake explained. "Items can circulate for years before washing ashore." Dorothy squeezed Sarah's hand, a silent signal between mother and daughter. Something about Jake's extensive knowledge felt unsettling. "Would you be willing to come to the station to give a formal statement?" Sheriff Collins asked Sarah. "We're reopening the investigation based on this new evidence." As they walked back toward the vehicles, Jake offered, "I know these woods better than anyone. I'd be happy to help with an expanded search." Sarah nodded absently, her mind still processing the shock of seeing Emma's shirt and Marcus's jacket after all these years. But a small voice in the back of her mind wondered, after 12 years of nothing, why had these perfectly preserved items suddenly appeared now? The Jefferson County Sheriff's Station was a small building with fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows across the worn furniture. Sarah sat rigidly in a metal chair, a cup of untouched coffee cooling before her. Sheriff Collins had asked her to recount the last time she'd seen Marcus and Emma, hoping the details might connect to their recent discovery. "It was a Saturday morning," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the pain etched on her face. "July 8, 2002. Marcus had been planning this trip for months. He grew up camping at Clearwater and wanted to share that with Emma." The memories flooded back with startling clarity. Marcus loading their blue Toyota van with fishing gear, Emma bouncing with excitement, her new pink backpack stuffed with snacks and her secret diary. Emma was 9, and it was her first real outdoor adventure, Sarah continued. She'd never been camping before. She was so excited about learning to fish and seeing the stars without city lights. Sheriff Collins nodded encouragingly, taking notes in a worn leather-bound notebook. They were supposed to call Sunday evening when they reached the campsite, but they never did. "I waited until Tuesday morning, trying not to panic." Sarah's voice finally cracked. "When I drove to the lake, their van was just sitting there in the resort parking lot. Empty. No signs of struggle. Their camping gear was gone, like they'd unloaded and headed to their site. But," she trailed off, the familiar weight of uncertainty crushing her chest once more. The door opened, and Jake Morrison entered with 3 fresh coffees. "Thought you might need these," he offered, setting them on the table. "Thank you, Jake," Sheriff Collins said, then turned back to Sarah. "And you've received no communication since then? No sightings, no leads?" Sarah shook her head. "Nothing concrete, just false hopes and dead ends." Jake leaned against the wall, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "The northern shores of Clearwater have underwater caves that create unusual current patterns," he interjected. "Could explain why the clothing was preserved and only surfaced now." Sarah looked up, struck by his specific knowledge. "How long have you worked as a ranger here?" "About 7 years," Jake answered smoothly, "but I've studied the area extensively." "The thing is," Jake continued, shifting his weight slightly. Those caves can trap things for years. Emma was probably frightened by the forest sounds at night. Kids usually are their first time camping. Sarah froze. I never said anything about Emma being afraid of the dark. Jake shrugged casually. Just an observation. Most children are. And Marcus seems like the type who would have done anything to protect his daughter. Dorothy, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. You speak as if you knew them personally, Mr. Morrison. Just professional insight, Jake replied quickly. I've seen many families camping over the years. Sheriff Collins seemed oblivious to the tension, but Dorothy's eyes narrowed slightly. Sarah noticed her mother's subtle scrutiny of Jake. The way Dorothy's gaze lingered on his hands, his uniform, the confidence with which he spoke about a case from 5 years before he claimed to have started working in the area. Well, Sheriff Collins said, closing his notebook, we'll have diving teams at the lake tomorrow. Mrs. Thornfield, if you and your mother could stay in town for a few days, we might need additional information as the search progresses. As they left the station, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jake Morrison knew far more about her family than any stranger should. Morning light glittered across Lake Clearwater as dive teams prepared their equipment. Sarah and Dorothy watched from the resort's wooden deck, both women wrapped in borrowed jackets against the mountain chill. Neither had slept much in the small motel room they'd rented the night before. They're starting at the spot where the items were found, Sheriff Collins explained, joining them with steaming cups of coffee. If there's anything else down there, we'll find it. Sarah nodded silently, her eyes fixed on the divers slipping beneath the lake's surface. 12 years of wondering, of imagining countless scenarios, some heartbreaking, some hopeful, might finally end today. Mind if I join you? Jake Morrison appeared beside them, his ranger uniform crisp in the morning light. I've marked some additional areas the divers should check based on the lake's current patterns. Thank you, Jake, Sheriff Collins said gratefully. Your knowledge of the area has been invaluable. As the sheriff walked away to coordinate with the dive team, Jake leaned against the railing beside Sarah and Dorothy. Beautiful morning, he commented. The lake's especially clear today. Mr. Morrison, Sarah began hesitantly. How exactly did you get involved with finding the clothes? Jake smiled easily. Call me Jake, please. And like I said, the fisherman contacted me first. Standard procedure when someone finds something unusual in my jurisdiction. You seem to know a lot about our case, Dorothy observed, her tone carefully neutral. It was big news back then, Jake replied. Everyone around here remembers it. Plus, I reviewed the old files when Sheriff Collins reopened the investigation. He turned to Sarah, his expression softening. Emma must have been terrified those first nights in the woods. The way the wind howls through the pines after dark. It sounds almost human sometimes. And the nocturnal animals. He shook his head. City kids aren't used to that. Sarah stiffened. Emma wasn't afraid of the dark or animals. She loved nature documentaries and begged us for camping trips. Marcus was the nervous one about wildlife. Jake's expression flickered momentarily before smoothing out. Of course, I just meant in general. And I'm sure Marcus was protective of her, the way fathers are with their daughters. How would you know that about Marcus? Dorothy asked sharply. Just an observation, Jake said, straightening up. Most fathers are protective, aren't they? An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Sarah studied Jake's face, trying to understand why his comments felt so intrusive, so presumptuous. As if he had intimate knowledge of her family's dynamics. You know, Dorothy said suddenly, I believe I left my reading glasses at your station yesterday. I can't see a thing without them. Jake looked surprised. I can take you back to get them after the dive team finishes. That would be very kind, Dorothy replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. When Jake excused himself to speak with one of the divers, Dorothy whispered to Sarah, his stories don't add up. He says he's worked here 7 years, but then mentioned the summer drought of 2001 affected ranger patrols. That's 9 years ago. Sarah frowned. And how does he know Emma was afraid of forest sounds? Or that Marcus was especially protective? I never mentioned those things. Let's see what else we can learn at his office, Dorothy murmured as Jake returned. Hours later, the dive team emerged empty-handed. No additional items were found. No bodies recovered. Sheriff Collins looked defeated as he announced they would expand the search perimeter tomorrow. "Why don't I take you ladies to my office to get those glasses?" Jake offered as the crowd dispersed. "Then maybe show you where the clothes were found from the shoreline perspective?" As they walked toward his ranger station, Sarah couldn't shake the growing sense that Jake Morrison was not simply being helpful. He was inserting himself deliberately into their lives and their tragedy. Jake's ranger station was a modest log structure nestled among towering pines, its windows reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Inside, the office was meticulously organized, maps covering one wall, emergency equipment stored in labeled cabinets, a desk with neatly arranged reports. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," Jake said, gesturing to two wooden chairs. "I'll look for your glasses, Mrs. Clark," Dorothy supplied. "Dorothy Clark. I think I left them on that shelf near your reference books." As Jake moved to the bookshelf, Dorothy nudged Sarah subtly, nodding toward the far corner of the room. Sarah followed her mother's gaze and felt her heart stutter. On a high shelf, partially hidden behind technical manuals, was a glimpse of something pink with silver accents. "I don't see any glasses here," Jake called, scanning the shelf Dorothy had indicated. "Perhaps they fell behind?" Dorothy suggested innocently. "My eyes aren't what they used to be, but I'm certain I set them down while looking at your trail maps." Jake frowned slightly but dutifully moved books and binders, searching for glasses that didn't exist. This gave Sarah the opportunity to stand and casually walk toward the corner shelf, pretending to examine the framed certificates on the wall. Her breath caught when she got a clearer view. It was a child's backpack, pink with silver star patterns, identical to the one Emma had carried on her last day. The same Adventure Kids brand, the same limited edition design with reinforced straps that Sarah had chosen because Emma had a habit of overpacking her books. Jake turned suddenly, catching Sarah's gaze fixed on the backpack. An almost imperceptible change crossed his face. A tightening around the eyes, a momentary tension in his jaw. "Admiring my niece's old backpack?" he asked, his voice carefully casual. "She outgrew it years ago." Sarah struggled to keep her expression neutral. It looks just like one my daughter had." Jake reached up and took down the backpack, turning it over in his hands. "These were pretty popular back in the day. Adventure Kids made good stuff." He hesitated, then extended it towards Sarah. "You know what? Why don't you take it? If it reminds you of Emma's." The offer was so unexpected, so inappropriate, that Sarah momentarily lost her words. Dorothy stepped in smoothly. "That's very kind, but surely your niece would want to keep it for sentimental reasons?" Jake shrugged. "She's in college now. Hasn't used this thing in years." He continued holding it out to Sarah. "Please, I insist. Maybe it would bring some comfort." Sarah took the backpack with trembling hands, noting its surprisingly good condition for something supposedly used by a child and then stored for years. "Thank you," she managed. "Never did find those glasses," Jake said, turning back to Dorothy. "Are you sure you had them here?" "My mistake," Dorothy replied with an apologetic smile. "I just remembered. I left them at the motel." Senior moment, I'm afraid. As they left the ranger station, Sarah clutched the pink backpack tightly, her mind racing. The coincidence was too perfect, too convenient, and Jake's eagerness to part with it felt wrong, almost as if he was relieved to have it out of his possession. Back in their motel room, Sarah examined the backpack more closely, her fingers running along the familiar star pattern. "This isn't just similar to Emma's," she whispered to Dorothy. "It's identical. Same model, same color, same silver stars." Emma's backpack was a birthday gift. I remember the salesperson saying they only made a limited number in this design. Dorothy nodded grimly. "And did you notice how quickly he offered to give it away? What man gives away his niece's belongings to strangers? We need to take this to someone who can verify it," Sarah said, turning the backpack over and noticing something odd about the inner label. "Someone who knows these products." And we need to do it without Jake Morrison finding out, Dorothy added, glancing nervously toward the window. The vintage clothing shop in downtown Portland was a treasure trove of fashion history, its walls lined with carefully preserved garments from decades past. Helen Martinez, the owner, was a slender woman in her 50s with sharp eyes behind cat eyeglasses and an encyclopedic knowledge of retail products. "Adventure kids," Helen murmured, examining the pink backpack carefully. This was their Stellar Explorer model, part of their 1989 to 1990 limited edition collection. She turned it over in her hands, fingers running expertly along the seams and attachments. Sarah leaned forward anxiously. "How limited was it?" "Very," Helen replied. "They only sold these in select department stores in the Pacific Northwest, maybe 1,000 units total. They were quite expensive for children's backpacks at the time, which limited their market." Helen's expression changed as she examined the inner label, her professional curiosity transforming into concern. "This is odd," she said, reaching for a magnifying glass from her desk. "The identification tag has been deliberately altered." "Altered how?" Dorothy asked, exchanging a worried glance with Sarah. Helen adjusted her glasses. "See these discoloration patterns? This type of damage is consistent with deliberate heat application. Someone used a tool to remove information." She looked up at Sarah. Adventure Kids products from this era had a sewn-in label where parents could write their child's name and contact information. Many stores offered this as a complimentary service at purchase. Sarah's hands trembled. "I had Emma's name embroidered on her backpack. Emma T. in purple thread." Helen nodded grimly. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't casual damage. It was a deliberate attempt to remove identifying information. See how carefully they avoided damaging the surrounding material. That takes knowledge and precision. Sarah sat back, her face pale. "So it could be Emma's backpack." "I can't say for certain without the identifying mark," Helen cautioned. "But given the rarity of this model and the specific tampering with the ID tag, I'd say it's highly suspicious." Dorothy squeezed Sarah's hand. "We need to take this to Sheriff Collins immediately." "I'd recommend caution," Helen advised, carefully placing the backpack in a cloth preservation bag. Whoever altered this knew what they were doing. This wasn't amateur work. The drive back toward Lake Clearwater was tense, with Sarah and Dorothy taking turns watching the rearview mirror. They had decided not to call ahead, not wanting to risk Jake Morrison learning of their discovery before they could present it to Sheriff Collins. "We should reach the county line in about an hour," Dorothy said, checking the map spread across her lap. "Then another 40 minutes to..." The car shuddered suddenly, the engine making an alarming grinding noise. Warning lights flashed across the dashboard as Sarah steered toward the shoulder, the vehicle losing power rapidly. "What's happening?" Dorothy asked, gripping the door handle. "I don't know," Sarah replied, fighting to keep the car straight as it slowed. "It was fine this morning during the mechanic's inspection." The car finally came to a stop on the narrow shoulder of the mountain road, steam hissing from under the hood. Sarah tried the ignition again, but the engine merely clicked weakly. "No cell service," Dorothy reported, checking her phone. "We're in a dead zone." Sarah popped the hood and stepped out, the mountain air cool against her face. Though not mechanically inclined, even she could see something was seriously wrong. Fluid was leaking from multiple locations, and a hose appeared to be partially severed. "This doesn't look like normal wear and tear," she said quietly to Dorothy, who had joined her. "It looks like..." The sound of an approaching vehicle made both women turn. A familiar Green Ranger truck slowed beside them, and Jake Morrison leaned out the window, concern etched on his face. "Car trouble?" he called. "I was heading back from a patrol and saw you ladies stranded." "What a coincidence." Sarah clutched the preservation bag containing the backpack tighter against her chest, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Looks like you've got a coolant leak and maybe worse," Jake observed, eyeing the engine. "There's no cell service for miles, and the tow company doesn't run after dark. Why don't I take you back to my station? You can call for help from there." Dorothy shot Sarah a warning glance, but they both knew they had few options on the isolated mountain road as sunset approached. "That would be very kind," Sarah said, forcing a grateful smile. "Thank you, Jake." Jake's ranger truck rumbled along the winding mountain road, each turn taking them deeper into the forest. Sarah clutched the cloth bag containing the backpack on her lap, her knuckles white with tension. Dorothy sat rigidly beside her, maintaining casual conversation with Jake, while her eyes constantly tracked their route. "So you ladies managed to get to Portland and back pretty quick," Jake commented, his tone conversational but his eyes repeatedly flicking to the rearview mirror. "Find anything interesting in the city?" "Just visiting an old friend," Dorothy replied smoothly. Sarah needed a break from the lake. Jake nodded, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. "The investigation getting to you? Understandable. Dredging up all those old memories must be difficult." "Sheriff Collins seemed optimistic about finding more evidence," Sarah said carefully, watching Jake's reaction. A muscle in his jaw tightened momentarily. "Oh? Did he mention anything specific they're looking for now?" "Just following standard procedures, I believe," Dorothy interjected. "Though we're planning to show him something interesting when we get back." Jake's hands stilled on the wheel. "Something interesting? What did you find?" Sarah clutched the bag tighter. "Just something we want his professional opinion on." "I could take a look," Jake offered too quickly. "Save you the trouble of waiting until we get to town." "That's kind, but we'd prefer to speak with the sheriff directly," Sarah said, noticing they had passed the turnoff that would have led toward the town and sheriff's station. "Jake, I believe you missed the turn for town," Dorothy observed calmly. Jake smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Taking a shortcut. These back roads are faster than going through town this time of day. Tourist traffic gets bad." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized they were traveling deeper into the forest, away from the main roads and cell service. The trees grew thicker here, blocking the fading sunlight and casting long shadows across the road. "How much further?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Not far now," Jake replied vaguely. "So, tell me more about what you found. Must be pretty important if you're so eager to get it to Collins." Dorothy changed tactics. "Actually, we were thinking about your niece's backpack. Such a coincidence that it's so similar to Emma's." "Yeah, weird coincidence," Jake agreed too readily. "Like I said, they were popular back then." "Your niece must be quite grown up now," Dorothy pressed. "College, you mentioned?" "That's right," Jake nodded. "State University. Engineering major." "How lovely," Dorothy smiled. "And what's her name? Perhaps she and Emma would have been classmates if—" Jake's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Jennifer," he said after a pause that lasted a beat too long. "Everyone calls her Jenny." Sarah caught Dorothy's eye. They both recognized the lie. The hesitation had been slight but unmistakable. "Beautiful name," Dorothy continued pleasantly. "And your brother or sister must be so proud of her." "Sister," Jake said tersely. "Look, we're almost at the ranger station. Reception's better there than in town anyway." But as they rounded the next bend, Sarah realized they weren't heading toward the ranger station they'd visited earlier. This road was narrower, rougher, clearly not frequently traveled. "Jake, this isn't the way to your station," Sarah said, abandoning pretense, her voice sharp with fear. "Different station," he replied smoothly. "The northern outpost has better equipment." Dorothy's hand found Sarah's and squeezed, a silent signal that confirmed their worst fears. Jake wasn't taking them to call for help. He was taking them somewhere isolated, somewhere no one would think to look for them. The truck slowed as they approached a clearing in the dense forest. Sarah's blood ran cold when she saw what waited there. Another vehicle, a black pickup truck, and a man leaning against it, tall, heavily built, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He straightened as Jake's truck approached, his hand moving to rest on something at his hip, something that glinted metallically in the fading light. "Ladies," Jake said, his voice now stripped of its former friendliness, "I'd like you to meet my associate, Brock Wheeler. I'm afraid your car troubles are about to become the least of your worries." "Get out," Jake ordered, His ranger persona completely vanished. His voice was flat, cold, utterly unlike the helpful guide they'd met at the lake. Sarah clutched the bag containing the backpack tightly to her chest as she and Dorothy slowly exited the truck. The clearing was surrounded by dense forest on all sides, the only sounds being the rustle of wind through the pines and the distant call of birds settling for the night. Brock Wheeler pushed himself away from his truck, revealing his full imposing height. Around 45, with hard eyes and a scar running along his jawline, he projected menace with every movement. When he smiled, Sarah felt a chill run through her body. "So these are the curious ones," Brock said, his voice surprisingly cultured, making it all the more unsettling. "The mother who couldn't let sleeping dogs lie." Jake nodded, moving to stand beside Brock. "Found them in Portland. They took the backpack to some expert." Brock's eyes narrowed. "Careless, Jake. Very careless, leaving that where they could find it." "It was hidden," Jake protested. "They were snooping." "What have you done with my daughter?" Sarah demanded, her fear transforming into maternal rage. "Where is Emma?" Brock laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the clearing. "Straight to the point. I like that." He produced a handgun from his waistband and gestured casually with it. "But I'll be asking the questions now. Hand over the backpack." Sarah hesitated, and Brock's expression hardened. "Now." Dorothy stepped forward slightly. "We've told people where we're going. The sheriff is expecting us." "No, he isn't," Jake said confidently. "You told no one about the backpack. I watched you leave the vintage shop and head straight for your car. No stops, no calls." Sarah felt a wave of nausea as she realized the implications. "You've been following us the whole time." Jake nodded, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Since the moment you arrived at the lake. I recognized you immediately from 12 years ago when you came looking for your family." The brutal confirmation that Jake knew about her family's disappearance struck Sarah like a physical blow. "It was you," she whispered. "You took them." "The backpack," Brock repeated, raising the gun. "Last chance." Sarah handed over the cloth bag, watching as Brock roughly extracted the pink backpack. "You shouldn't have gotten curious about things from the past, Mrs. Thornfield," Jake said, producing a set of zip ties from his pocket. "Some things are better left buried." "Like my husband?" Sarah challenged, her voice breaking. A flicker of something, not quite guilt, but recognition, crossed Jake's face before his expression hardened again. "Turn around, both of you. Hands behind your backs." As Jake secured their wrists with the zip ties, Brock produced duct tape and roughly covered their mouths. The adhesive pulled at Sarah's skin painfully, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the terror now coursing through her. "Load them up," Brock ordered. "We need to move before someone notices they're missing." Jake guided them toward the truck bed, which had been covered with a hard shell top. When he opened it, Sarah was horrified to see it had been modified. The interior was stripped bare, with metal hooks bolted to the sides and a small barred window separating it from the cab. "Don't worry," Brock said, noticing her expression. "It's not a long trip to your new home, though I can't promise it'll be comfortable." As they were forced into the cramped space, Dorothy managed to catch Sarah's eye. Despite the dire situation, her mother's gaze held steady determination. They would find a way through this, they had to, for Emma. The truck began moving, jolting painfully over the uneven forest road. Through the small window, Sarah could see Jake following in his Ranger vehicle, the official emblem on its door now a mockery of the authority it represented. They weren't heading toward town or any marked road. They were traveling deeper into the wilderness, to a place where screams would go unheard and searchers would never think to look. The journey through darkening forest lasted nearly an hour, each bump and turn disorienting Sarah and Dorothy as they lay bound in the truck bed. When the vehicle finally stopped, the sudden silence was almost as terrifying as the journey had been. The shell door swung open, revealing Brock's imposing silhouette against a twilight sky. "Welcome home," he said with mock hospitality, reaching in to drag them out one by one. Sarah's legs buckled after the confinement, but Brock yanked her upright with bruising force. As her vision adjusted, the compound before her came into focus. A main cabin built of dark timber, 2 smaller outbuildings, and an old Airstream trailer positioned at the edge of the clearing. The entire area was surrounded by dense forest, with no visible road or path leading out. "Nice setup, isn't it?" Brock commented, noting her inspection. "Completely off-grid. No electricity lines, no water pipes, no paper trail. Officially, this place doesn't exist." Jake appeared beside them, no longer in his ranger uniform but wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt that somehow made him look more menacing than the official attire had. "Get them inside," Brock ordered. "I need to check on the others." Others. The word sent a jolt through Sarah. Could Emma be here, alive after all these years? She strained to see the other buildings, and as if in answer to her unspoken question, a faint movement caught her eye. A curtain shifting in one of the smaller structures, a shadow passing behind it. Jake pushed them toward the main cabin, but Sarah dragged her feet, desperate for another glimpse of the outbuilding where she'd seen movement. Her resistance earned her a painful shove between the shoulder blades. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Jake muttered, opening the cabin door and forcing them inside. The cabin's interior was surprisingly ordinary. A living area with worn furniture, a small kitchen with propane appliances, walls lined with books and survival supplies. The normalcy made the situation all the more surreal. Seated in a rocking chair by a cold fireplace was an elderly man, perhaps in his 70s, with thinning white hair and deeply lined features. He looked up as they entered, his roomy eyes widening at the sight of the bound women. "Damn it, Jake," the old man said, his voice cracking with age and what sounded like despair. "More visitors?" "Shut up, Walt," Jake snapped. "Just do what you're told and there won't be trouble." Walt. The name triggered a connection in Sarah's mind. Jake Morrison. Walt Morrison. Father and son? Jake removed the tape from their mouths, the sudden rip making both women wince in pain. "Please," Sarah gasped as soon as she could speak. "My daughter, is she here? Is Emma alive?" Walt glanced nervously toward the door before meeting Sarah's gaze. "The girl is alive," he whispered, his words sending a shock wave through Sarah's body. "But Brock," "I said shut up," Jake hissed, moving threateningly toward the old man. Walt flinched but continued, words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "He's dangerous, more than you know. He collects people like trophies. Jake brings them in with that uniform, looking all official and trustworthy. And Brock." The door banged open, and Brock filled the frame, his expression thunderous. "Telling stories again, old man?" he growled, striding forward to tower over Walt. "Remember what happened last time you couldn't keep your mouth shut?" Walt's face drained of color as he shrank back in his chair. Brock turned to Jake. "Tie them to the support posts. I want them secure when we move them to the trailer." As Jake secured them to wooden columns supporting the cabin's roof, Sarah studied Walt Morrison more carefully. His hands trembled constantly, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had witnessed horrors but been powerless to stop them. "He's Jake's father," Dorothy whispered, following Sarah's gaze. "Look at their profiles. Same nose, same brow line." "Enough talking," Brock commanded, checking their restraints. Satisfied, he turned to Jake. "Keep watch. I need to prepare the trailer for our new guests." When Brock had left, the tension in the room reduced fractionally. Walt glanced at the door, then leaned forward slightly. "Listen to me," he whispered urgently. "The girl, your daughter, she doesn't speak anymore. Hasn't in years. But she's alive. In the far structure." His voice broke. "I'm sorry. I couldn't stop them. He threatens to kill me if Jake doesn't help him." "My father's weak," Jake said coldly from his position by the window. "Always has been." "And you're a monster," Dorothy replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "Helping that man abduct innocent people." Jake's face hardened, but before he could respond, Brock's voice boomed from outside, calling his name. "Don't try anything," Jake warned as he moved to the door. "There's nowhere to run out here." As the door closed behind him, Sarah met Walt's desperate gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. They were both parents who would do anything to save their children. Even in the most hopeless circumstances, when Brock returned, his demeanor had changed. There was an anticipatory gleam in his eyes that made Sarah's skin crawl. He cut their bindings from the support posts but kept their hands secured. "Time for a family reunion," he announced with cruel pleasure. "But first, some ground rules. You make any noise I don't approve of, you try to run, you do anything stupid?" He paused, drawing a hunting knife from his belt. "And we'll see how many fingers the old lady needs to keep." Dorothy stood straighter, refusing to be intimidated despite the explicit threat. Sarah followed her mother's example, summoning strength she didn't know she had. Brock marched them across the clearing toward the Airstream trailer. The metal structure gleamed dully in the last light of day, its windows covered from the inside with what appeared to be newspaper. Jake followed behind, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Ladies first," Brock said with mock courtesy, opening the trailer door and shoving them inside. The stench hit Sarah immediately. Unwashed bodies, fear, and despair concentrated in the small space. As her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, illuminated only by a battery-powered lamp, she made out 3 figures huddled at the far end of the trailer. 3 young women, all appearing to be in their early 20s, sat on thin mattresses on the floor. Their clothing was mismatched and worn, their hair dull and tangled. But it was their eyes that struck Sarah most deeply, vacant, hopeless, the look of people who had endured too much for too long. "New friends for you," Brock announced to the women. "Be nice now." None of the captives responded or even looked up. Their stillness was unnatural, learned through what Sarah could only imagine was brutal conditioning. "This one," Brock said, gesturing to a thin woman with dirty blonde hair. "We call Annie. She's been with us the longest. Very well behaved now, aren't you, Annie?" The young woman, Annie, showed no reaction to her name or Brock's attention. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her body language suggesting she was trying to make herself as small as possible. Sarah studied Annie more carefully. Something about the young woman's profile, the curve of her cheekbone, the shape of her mouth, it triggered a deep, instinctive recognition. Could it be possible? After 12 years? "Emma?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Annie flinched almost imperceptibly but didn't look up. Brock laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, she doesn't respond to that name anymore. That girl is long gone. Annie here is what's left." "What did you do to her?" Dorothy demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "Helped her adjust to her new reality," Brock replied casually. "Some take to it better than others. The man with the red beard, for instance, he just wouldn't adapt. Tried to be a hero the very first night." He shook his head in mock sadness. "Heroism is overrated, isn't it, Annie?" At the mention of the man with the red beard, Annie's hands began to tremble in her lap, though her expression remained carefully blank. "Marcus," Sarah breathed, her worst fears confirmed. "You killed my husband." Brock shrugged. "He made his choice. Fought back when we took the girl. Most parents do, but he was particularly determined." He smiled coldly. The girl watched the whole thing, probably why she stopped talking after that. "Isn't that right, Annie?" Annie remained silent, but Sarah noticed a single tear tracking down her cheek, the first emotion the young woman had shown. "What kind of monster are you?" Dorothy asked, her voice low and dangerous. "The kind who appreciates collecting unique things," Brock replied, gesturing around the trailer. "Some men collect stamps or coins. I prefer more interactive collections." Sarah fought against the horror threatening to overwhelm her. If this young woman was indeed Emma, her Emma, then she had endured 12 years of unimaginable trauma, watching her father die before being held captive by his murderer. "Look at me," Sarah pleaded softly to Annie. "Please, just look at me." For a moment, it seemed Annie wouldn't respond. Then, slowly, she raised her head. Her eyes, once bright blue and full of childish mischief, were now dull and guarded. But they were unmistakably Emma's eyes, now set in the face of a young woman of 21. "Well, isn't this touching?" Brock interrupted. Mother and daughter together at last. Enjoy it while it lasts. He turned to Jake. Secure them here for the night. Tomorrow we'll prepare the new accommodations. The curious ones always require special attention. As Brock left the trailer, Jake began binding Sarah and Dorothy to metal rings bolted to the trailer floor. Through it all, Emma watched with an expression of carefully controlled emptiness that broke Sarah's heart more thoroughly than any display of emotion could have. Dawn brought no comfort to the cramped trailer. Sarah and Dorothy had spent the night bound to the floor, drifting in and out of fitful sleep. The three captive women had barely moved, trained by years of captivity to remain still and silent. Sarah hadn't taken her eyes off Emma for more than a few moments. The young woman avoided direct eye contact but occasionally glanced towards Sarah when she thought no one was watching. The trailer door banged open, flooding the space with morning light. Brock entered, followed by Jake carrying a tray of meager food. "Rise and shine, ladies," Brock announced. "Big day today." Jake set down the tray and began untying Sarah and Dorothy from the floor rings, though their wrists remained bound. The captive women moved robotically toward the food, taking small, measured portions. "Annie," Brock called sharply, "no breakfast for you yet. You have a job to do." The young woman froze, then set down her piece of bread and stood with her head bowed submissively. "I've been thinking about our situation," Brock continued, turning to Sarah. "You claim this girl is your daughter, Emma, but how can I be sure? It's been 12 years. Memories fade." "She is my daughter," Sarah said firmly. "I know my own child." Brock smiled coldly. "Mothers always say that, don't they? But I need proof, so we're going to play a little game." He gestured to the three young women, now standing in a row, heads bowed. "One of these women is allegedly your long-lost daughter. The other two joined our family in similar circumstances. Your task is simple. Identify which one is Emma." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "This is sick." "Maybe," Brock shrugged, "but necessary. If you truly are her mother, you should be able to recognize your own flesh and blood. Shouldn't you? Even after all these years." "And if I get it right?" Sarah asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. "Then I'll know you're telling the truth about being her mother," Brock replied vaguely. "If you're wrong." He let the implication hang in the air. "What's the point of this cruelty?" Dorothy demanded. "Insurance," Jake answered from the doorway. "If you can identify her, it means you really are who you say you are." "You have 1 minute," Brock announced. "Choose wisely." Sarah studied the three women carefully. All were similar in height and build, all with dirty blonde hair hanging limply around drawn faces. They stood with identical postures of submission, eyes downcast. Sarah stepped closer to the first woman, searching for any distinguishing features. Nothing familiar caught her eye. She moved to the second, whose trembling hands suggested fear of being selected. Finally, she stood before Annie, the woman Brock had indicated had been there longest. Sarah's heart pounded as she looked for confirmation of what she already felt intuitively. Then she saw it. A small scar on the young woman's forehead, partially hidden by her hair. Emma had gotten that scar at age 7 when she fell from her bicycle, requiring 3 stitches at the emergency room. But Sarah needed to be absolutely certain. She leaned closer and whispered so only Annie could hear, "Do you remember our secret place in the attic where we used to hide cookies from Daddy?" It had been their special game. Sarah and Emma would sneak cookies into a small nook in the attic where Marcus never looked. Their private mother-daughter conspiracy. Annie's eyes remained downcast, but Sarah saw her eyelids flutter. Then, almost imperceptibly, a single tear slid down her cheek. "Time's up," Brock announced. "Who is your daughter, Mrs. Thornfield?" Dorothy had been observing closely and moved to stand beside Sarah. Without hesitation, they both pointed to Annie. "Her," Sarah said firmly. "This is Emma." Brock's expression shifted to cruel amusement. Well, maternal instinct prevails." He nodded to Jake. "Take the other two back to their quarters." As Jake led the other women out, Brock circled Annie like a predator. 12 years I've called her Annie, and she's answered to it. 12 years of remaking her into something new. And yet, here you come. And suddenly she remembers being Emma. He grabbed Annie's chin roughly, forcing her to look up. Is that true? Do you remember being Emma Thornfield? Annie's face remained expressionless, her eyes vacant, but her hands trembled at her sides. She won't speak, Brock said, releasing her. Hasn't said a word in years. Not since she watched her father die trying to protect her. He smiled at Sarah. Congratulations. You found your daughter. But I'm afraid Emma doesn't exist anymore. This shell is all that's left. Sarah met her daughter's eyes directly for the first time. Behind the practiced emptiness, she caught a flicker, faint but unmistakable, of the bright, brave girl she had lost 12 years ago. You're wrong, Sarah said quietly. My daughter is still in there, and I'm taking her home. Brock laughed. Bold words from someone in your position. Very bold indeed. Take mother and daughter to the shed. Brock ordered Jake. The old woman stays here. Insurance against any heroics. No, Sarah protested as Jake grabbed her arm. We stay together. You don't make the rules here, Brock growled, producing his handgun. Move, now. Jake led Sarah and Annie out of the trailer, leaving Dorothy bound to the floor ring. The morning air was crisp, the surrounding forest quiet except for distant birdsong that seemed mockingly peaceful against their desperate situation. The shed was a weathered structure with a padlocked door. Jake unlocked it and pushed them inside. A single room with dirt floor, a small window, and shelves lined with tools and supplies. Wait here, Jake said unnecessarily. Brock will decide what happens next. As the door closed and the padlock clicked, Sarah turned to Annie, to Emma. Her daughter stood motionless, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the floor. Emma, Sarah whispered, approaching slowly as if approaching a wounded animal. Emma, it's Mom. I've been looking for you for so long. The young woman's breathing quickened, but she didn't respond or look up. I know you're scared, Sarah continued, her voice breaking. I know terrible things have happened to you, but I'm here now and we're going to get out of this. Somehow, outside, raised voices caught their attention. Through the small window, Sarah could see Brock gesturing angrily at Jake, who seemed to be arguing back, a dynamic she hadn't witnessed before. The shed door suddenly opened, and Walt Morrison stumbled in, pushed by Brock. Keep the old man company, Brock sneered. Jake seems to think his precious father needs protection. Heartwarming. He slammed the door, the lock clicking into place again. Walt steadied himself against a shelf, his weathered face lined with shame and fear. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry for everything. You knew, Sarah said. Not a question but an accusation. You knew all this time what they were doing. Walt nodded miserably. Brock threatened to kill me if Jake didn't help him. Started small, breaking into vacation cabins, theft. Then it escalated. He glanced at Emma. By the time they took your daughter and killed your husband, Jake was in too deep, and I was too cowardly to stop it. Why now? Sarah demanded. Why try to help us now? Because I can't live with it anymore? Walt replied, his eyes filling with tears. The nightmares, the guilt. And Jake, he's not like Brock. He was a good boy once. Brock corrupted him, used his loyalty to me as leverage. Through the window, they could see Brock and Jake still arguing near the main cabin. Brock's face was twisted with rage as he jabbed a finger into Jake's chest. Listen carefully, Walt whispered urgently. There's an emergency flare in that tool chest. I've kept it hidden for years, waiting for a chance. He moved to a battered metal box and retrieved a flare gun from beneath false bottom. One shot, it'll be visible for miles. The authorities won't find us in time, Sarah said, eyeing the flare gun skeptically. They might, Walt countered. There's a Forest Service helicopter that patrols these mountains daily looking for wildfires. Standard route. Should pass within visual range in about 30 minutes. Outside, the argument between Brock and Jake was escalating. Brock's hand moved to his holstered weapon. We need a distraction, Walt said. his voice steadying with resolve. "Something to keep Brock occupied while we fire the flare." Before Sarah could respond, Walt moved to the door and began pounding on it. "Brock! Jake! Something's wrong with the girl. She's collapsed. Hurry!" Footsteps approached rapidly. Walt turned to Sarah, pressing the flare gun into her hands. "Wait until they're focused on me," he whispered. "One shot through the window. Make it count." The padlock rattled, and Walt squared his shoulders. For the first time, Sarah saw determination replace the fear in the old man's eyes. The door swung open, and Brock appeared, scowling. "What's the—" Walt lunged forward with surprising strength, driving his shoulder into Brock's midsection. The larger man stumbled backward, momentarily caught off guard. Jake stood frozen behind him, shock evident on his face. "Dad, no!" Jake shouted as Walt and Brock grappled on the ground. "Run, Jake!" Walt gasped, struggling to hold Brock down. "Get away from him! Be your own man!" Brock roared with rage, reaching for his weapon. Walt grabbed his wrist, the two men wrestling for control of the gun. Sarah raised the flare gun toward the window, but hesitated. Firing would draw attention to themselves immediately. The decision was made for her when the struggle outside reached its violent climax. A gunshot cracked the morning silence, followed by Walt's pained cry. "Now!" Sarah shouted, aiming the flare gun through the window and pulling the trigger. The flare shot skyward with a piercing whistle, erupting into a brilliant red starburst against the blue morning sky, a desperate call for help that would be visible for miles. The flare's red glow hung in the sky like an accusing finger, marking their location for anyone searching. Brock staggered to his feet, blood splattered across his shirt. Walt's blood. The old man lay motionless on the ground, his sacrifice made. "You stupid bitch," Brock snarled, raising his gun toward the shed window where Sarah still stood. "Brock, stop!" Jake shouted, his voice cracking with emotion as he knelt beside his father. "This has gone too far. Gone too far." Brock laughed maniacally. "We're just getting started." He stormed toward the shed, weapon raised. Sarah pulled Emma to the far corner, shielding her daughter with her body. After 12 years of separation, she wouldn't let Emma witness another parent's murder. The door burst open, and Brock stood framed in the entrance, rage distorting his features. "You think that flare will save you? By the time anyone gets here, you'll be—" A distant sound interrupted him, the rhythmic chopping of helicopter blades. Brock's expression shifted from rage to calculation in an instant. "Change of plans," he announced, grabbing Emma's arm roughly. "We're leaving. She's coming with me as insurance." "No!" Sarah lunged forward, but Brock backhanded her with his free hand, sending her sprawling to the dirt floor. "Mom!" Emma whispered, the first word she had spoken in years, so soft it was almost inaudible. Brock dragged Emma from the shed toward his truck, shouting at Jake, "Get the guns! All of them! We're moving out!" Jake stood paralyzed, looking between his wounded father and Brock. In that moment of hesitation, another sound joined the approaching helicopter sirens, faint but unmistakable, coming from the forest road. "Jake!" Brock bellowed. "Now!" But Jake had made his choice. He reached for his father's hand, then looked up at Brock with newfound defiance. "No, it's over, Brock. I won't do this anymore." Brock's face contorted with betrayal. "After everything I did for you, everything we built here." "You built this," Jake replied, his voice steady. "I was just your puppet." "Not anymore." Brock raised his gun toward Jake, but before he could fire, the helicopter crested the treeline, its spotlight sweeping the clearing. Simultaneously, the first police vehicles appeared on the crude access road, lights flashing. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" A voice boomed through a loudspeaker. Brock, still gripping Emma, backed toward his truck, using her as a shield. "Stay back," he shouted. "I'll kill her." Sarah struggled to her feet, desperation giving her strength. Through the shed window, she could see tactical officers taking positions around the clearing, weapons trained on Brock. A single shot cracked through the air, precise, controlled. Brock jerked backward, a red stain blossoming on his shoulder. His grip on Emma loosened, and she twisted free, running toward the shed, toward her mother. Within moments, the clearing was swarming with federal agents and local police. Brock was subdued and handcuffed, his curses and threats fading into pained groans. Jake surrendered immediately, hands raised, relief washing over his face as medical personnel attended to his father. Sarah held Emma tightly. 12 years of separation dissolved in the fierce protection of a mother's embrace. Her daughter trembled violently, her face buried against Sarah's shoulder. Dorothy was brought from the trailer, pale but unharmed. The family reunion amid the chaos was tearful and surreal. 3 women bound by blood and now by shared trauma. In the hours that followed, the full horror of Brock Wheeler's operation was revealed. The compound was processed as a crime scene, evidence collected from every building. Under questioning, Jake Morrison broke down completely, offering full cooperation in exchange for consideration during sentencing. His confession was comprehensive. Brock had killed Marcus Thornfield the first night of the abduction when he attempted to fight back to protect Emma. The 9-year-old had witnessed her father's murder, the trauma silencing her more effectively than any threat could have. Jake admitted to helping dispose of Marcus's body deep in the forest, marking the location on a map for authorities. The clothing recently found in the lake had indeed been planted there deliberately. Brock's idea to draw attention away from their actual location as search activity in the area had increased. "We kept the backpack and some other items as trophies," Jake admitted, his voice hollow with shame. "Brock made me alter the label to remove Emma's name. Said it was too risky to keep otherwise." The other women were identified as victims of similar abductions from wilderness areas across 3 states over the past decade. Each had been renamed, their identities systematically erased through isolation and psychological conditioning. As night fell, Sarah sat in a hospital waiting room, Emma asleep with her head in Sarah's lap, Dorothy keeping vigil beside them. For the first time in 12 years, Sarah allowed herself to believe that the nightmare might truly be ending, though the road to healing had only just begun. The hospital corridor buzzed with activity. Doctors conferring in hushed tones, police officers standing guard, social workers moving purposefully between rooms. For days had passed since the rescue, each hour bringing new revelations about the extent of Brock Wheeler's crimes. Sarah sat beside Emma's hospital bed, watching her daughter sleep. At 21, Emma's face still held echoes of the 9-year-old child who had disappeared, but trauma had carved new lines, new hollows. The medical staff had been gentle but honest. Emma's physical health was compromised by years of neglect, and her psychological wounds ran deeper still. "Mrs. Thornfield?" A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Melissa Ramsey, the trauma specialist assigned to Emma's case, stood in the doorway. "May I speak with you for a moment?" In the hallway, Dorothy was already waiting, her face lined with concern. The 3 women moved to a small consultation room where Dr. Ramsey closed the door. "Emma's showing signs of severe post-traumatic stress disorder. As expected, the doctor began. But there's something you should be prepared for. At this point, she doesn't fully recognize you as her mother." Despite having suspected this, the confirmation hit Sarah like a physical blow. "She called me Mom during the rescue," she whispered. "Yes, and that's actually encouraging," Dr. Ramsey nodded. "But right now, she's referring to you primarily as the kind lady. Memory fragmentation is common in long-term captivity cases, especially when the trauma began in childhood." "Will she ever truly remember me? Us?" Dorothy asked, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "There's reason for cautious optimism," the doctor replied. "Emma preserved certain childhood memories as a survival mechanism. She's mentioned hiding a diary in her backpack, the same backpack that was kept as a trophy. That diary might be an important link to her past identity." Later that afternoon, Detective Larson arrived with evidence bags containing items recovered from Brock's compound. Among them was a small, weather-beaten notebook, Emma's diary, its pink cover faded, its lock broken long ago. "We've documented it thoroughly," Detective Larson explained. You can look through it now if you'd like. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the diary. Emma's childish handwriting filled the pages. Accounts of school days, friendship dramas, and family moments. The final entry, dated July 8, 2002, read, "Going camping with Daddy tomorrow. First real wilderness adventure. Mom's worried, but I'm so excited." Sarah closed the diary, unable to continue reading the innocent words of a child who had no idea how drastically her life was about to change. During therapy sessions over the following days, fragments of Emma's memories emerged like pieces of a shattered mirror. She remembered Marcus trying to fight off Brock and Jake that first night at the campsite. She recalled years of psychological manipulation, of being told her parents had abandoned her, of being renamed Annie, and punished whenever she responded to Emma. Most surprisingly, she spoke of Jake showing small, secret kindnesses over the years. Extra food slipped to her when Brock wasn't looking, a blanket during cold nights, warnings about Brock's volatile moods. These tiny acts of decency, insufficient though they were, had helped preserve some spark of humanity within her. "He was scared of Brock too," Emma whispered during one session, her voice still unfamiliar with use. "Not like me, but scared differently." Walt Morrison, who had survived Brock's gunshot wound, confirmed this from his hospital bed. "Jake was 17 when Brock first threatened to kill me if the boy didn't help him," the old man explained to investigators. By the time he realized what kind of monster Brock truly was, he felt trapped. Too guilty to leave, too afraid to seek help. This context didn't excuse Jake's actions, but it helped explain the conflict they had witnessed during the final confrontation. The son torn between lifelong submission and newfound conscience. For Dorothy, the focus remained solely on her family's healing. At 68, she became the steady foundation upon which their recovery would be built, her unwavering strength a touchstone for both Sarah and Emma. One morning, during a quiet moment in Emma's hospital room, the young woman looked up from the diary she had been reading and studied Dorothy's face with unusual intensity. "Grandma Dorothy?" she asked hesitantly, the name emerging from some preserved corner of childhood memory. "You used to make apple pancakes on Sundays. With cinnamon." Dorothy's breath caught. "Yes, sweetheart. Every Sunday." It was a small breakthrough, but in the landscape of their shattered lives, even the smallest recovered fragment was precious beyond measure. 3 months after the rescue, Sarah stood at the edge of Lake Clearwater, autumn leaves drifting across its mirror-like surface. Beside her, Emma gazed at the water, her face a complex mixture of fear and determination. Dorothy waited in the car, allowing mother and daughter this necessary moment alone. "We don't have to stay," Sarah said softly. "We can leave anytime you want." Emma shook her head, the breeze ruffling her newly cut hair. "I need to be here, to reclaim it." It had been a journey measured in small victories. After weeks in the hospital, Emma had moved into Sarah's Portland home, the same house she had left as a child, though Sarah had carefully updated Emma's old bedroom to suit a young woman rather than the 9-year-old frozen in time. The legal proceedings continued in parallel with their healing. Brock Wheeler faced multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. Jake Morrison, in exchange for his complete cooperation, received a reduced sentence that acknowledged both his crimes and the coercion under which he had operated. Walt Morrison had testified against Brock from his hospital bed, his testimony proving crucial to ensuring the maximum sentence. The old man would likely live out his remaining years under house arrest, a punishment that balanced justice with recognition of his final act of courage. Marcus's body had been recovered from the location Jake identified, allowing the family to finally hold a proper funeral. Standing at her husband's grave, Sarah had felt a complex mixture of closure and renewed grief, mourning not only Marcus's death but the years stolen from them all. The most precious moments in their recovery came unexpectedly. Emma humming a forgotten childhood song while washing dishes. Dorothy finding her granddaughter asleep with a photo album open to family pictures. The morning Emma had called Sarah Mom, with full awareness and recognition for the first time since her rescue. There had been setbacks too. Nightmares that left Emma screaming in the darkness. Days when she couldn't bear to be touched or even spoken to. The panic attack when a red-bearded man had passed them in the grocery store. Each challenge faced together one day at a time. Now, standing at the lake where it had all begun, Emma took a deep breath and spoke the words she had been practicing with her therapist. "This place doesn't own me anymore," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "What happened here is part of my story, but it isn't my whole story." Sarah watched her daughter carefully. At 21, Emma stood on the threshold of an adulthood that had been violently interrupted. She had decided to keep Annie as her middle name, not as a reminder of her captivity, but as acknowledgement of the person she had become through survival. "I remember Daddy teaching me to skip stones here," Emma said suddenly, bending to pick up a flat pebble from the shore. "Before everything, he said the secret was all in the wrist." Sarah's throat tightened. "He was terrible at it." All his stones sank immediately. A ghost of a smile touched Emma's lips, but he kept trying. Every time, Emma turned the stone in her fingers, then with a fluid motion, sent it skipping across the lake's surface. 1, 2, 3, for bounces before it disappeared beneath the water. "He would be so proud of you," Sarah whispered. "So proud of your strength." Emma reached for her mother's hand. Another small victory, as physical contact had been difficult for her since the rescue. Together they stood at the edge of the water that had taken so much from them, yet somehow, against all odds, had given them back to each other. "Let's go home," Emma said finally. "Grandma's waiting." As they walked back toward the car where Dorothy waited, Emma paused to look back at the lake one last time. The setting sun gilded the water's surface, transforming the scene of their darkest tragedy into something unexpectedly beautiful. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" Emma asked, her voice holding both question and answer. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "Yes," she said with certainty born of their shared resilience. "Different than before, but yes, we're going to be okay." Dorothy waved from the car, her familiar gesture a beacon of normality in a world forever changed. As they joined her, 3 generations of women bound by blood and forged stronger through unimaginable adversity. The future stretched before them, uncertain but facing it together, finally whole.